The war did not feel real to Archivist Counselor Sinvale until the enemy stopped firing. For 11 years the Black Tide had moved the same way across every coalition map, swallowing trade corridors, border suns, defense stations, and then the names of the worlds themselves, until loss became less an event than a rhythm the galaxy endured. Emergency sessions had their own choreography now. Admirals arrived carrying casualty projections like funeral tablets. Diplomats argued over evacuation rights with the brittle politeness of people dividing inheritance before the house had finished burning. Whole species had begun negotiating not for victory, but for which fragments of themselves might still exist when the tide reached the core. That was the atmosphere inside the Hall of Measures when the final summons was called. Not hope, not courage, but the exhausted administrative management of extinction. The great chamber blazed with tactical light. 1,000 red vectors crossed the suspended star map, each one marking a front collapsing somewhere too far away to save. Fleet totals rolled in columns along the lower ring, and every update made the same point in a new language. The coalition could still gather ships. It could still gather crews. It could still make speeches about unity. What it could no longer gather was time. Sen watched the enemy advance clock descend through another projected quarter cycle and understood, with a coldness so clean it almost felt like relief, that the room had already accepted the truth. They were not here to decide how to win. They were here to decide how to lose with order. Then the human delegation ruined the script. They had spoken little since arrival. No dramatic objections, no pleas for trust, no theatrical promises from a young civilization desperate to prove itself. Ambassador Leora Vance sat through 4 hours of surrender disguised as planning with her hands folded and her expression unreadable, studying the war map not like a mourner but like an engineer waiting for a machine to reveal where it was weakest. When the final request came for total Allied mobilization, every species pledged what remained. Carrier groups. Reserve wings. Orbital foundries. Funeral numbers offered as courage. Then Vance rose and informed the chamber, in a voice calm enough to insult them all, that humanity would not be contributing a fleet. It would be contributing one vessel. The outrage hit the hall before the silence did. Sen felt it race through the delegation tiers like heat through cracked metal. One ship against an enemy that had consumed sectors. One ship when civilizations were emptying their arsenals into the dark. But Vance did not retreat, did not explain, did not soften the blow. She only added one final detail before taking her seat again. The vessel had already departed 4 days earlier. And at that exact moment, the red advance clocks over 3 frontline systems flickered, stalled, and began counting in the wrong direction. N01 in the Hall of Measures spoke for several seconds after the frontline clocks reversed, which in itself was shocking enough to feel like a breach of physics. Coalition command chambers were built on noise. Even at their most disciplined, they breathed with translation pulses, tactical revisions, officer crosstalk, and the endless dry language of systems trying to make catastrophe legible. Yet now the great chamber held a silence so complete Sun could hear the low electrical shimmer inside the suspended star map. 3 sectors that had not slowed in 11 years had just hesitated together, and humanity had announced a single unnamed vessel already moving somewhere beyond coalition sight. The sequence was too perfect to be coincidence, too abrupt to be comfortable, and too deliberate to ignore. Then the room erupted. Admirals demanded designation codes. Ministers called for disclosure protocols. 2 delegations openly accused the humans of unauthorized action inside coalition jurisdiction, while another demanded to know whether a hidden weapon had been deployed without interspecies review. The loudest anger came, as it often did, from species that had lost the most ground and therefore had the least patience left for mystery. Sin understood that anger. It was not only outrage. It was humiliation. The coalition had spent a decade bleeding itself slowly into competence, learning how to retreat without collapse and how to call that skill strategy. Now humanity had arrived late, withheld everything, and somehow touched the enemy's advance with one invisible hand. Through all of it, Ambassador Leora Vance remained infuriatingly still. When the chamber marshal finally restored enough order for speech to resume, she gave them almost nothing. The vessel, she said, had been deployed under sovereign human authority against a lawful hostile force operating beyond recognized coalition civilian zones. It posed no threat to Allied infrastructure. Its actions had been calibrated in anticipation of this exact emergency threshold. Further details would be provided only to a restricted wartime review circle once initial results could be confirmed. She delivered each line with the composure of someone offering procedural clarification rather than rewriting the emotional balance of the room. The restraint made it worse. Had she sounded proud, some could have dismissed her. Had she sounded defensive, they could have pressed harder. Instead, she sounded like a woman confirming sunrise. Sen had spent most of his professional life studying how powerful people behaved when they knew more than the room. Bluff had a texture. Concealment had a rhythm. Fear hid in the jaw before it reached the voice. Vance showed none of the familiar fractures. Whatever she was withholding, she was not improvising it. By the time the emergency session dissolved into closed consultations, the frontline updates had become even stranger. The 3 stalled sectors remained stalled. Not destroyed, not contested in any conventional sense, simply delayed. Enemy spear formations that usually advanced with machine consistency now sat in widening cones of operational uncertainty. Recon drones fed back contradictory telemetry. Supply lanes remained physically intact, yet movement along them had begun to bunch and stagger as if invisible pressure had altered timing across thousands of ships at once. One corridor showed a full support train reversing for 9 minutes before correcting course. Another displayed 4 escorts holding formation around an empty transport vector no scanner could locate. Nothing fit a normal engagement profile. No debris fields. No weapons bloom. No wideband distress traffic. It was as if the enemy's war machine had flinched without being struck. That was the first moment fear changed shape inside the coalition. Until then, fear had been familiar. Fear of annihilation, of retreat, of one more year watching maps become eulogies. This was something sharper. Uncertainty. Not about the enemy, but about the humans. In the private corridors of the command citadel, the uncertainty spread faster than any official briefing. Some called it arrogance, some called it fraud, and some, usually in lower voices, called it preparation. Sen heard all 3 in the span of 10 minutes while moving from the hall toward the archival ring where restricted wartime records could be requested. He heard a naval prefect from the Iller mutter that no species sends one ship unless it intends symbolism. He heard a logistics minister reply that symbolism does not cause 4 enemy supply chains to miss synchronized transfer windows in the same hour. He heard a junior doctrine aide, too stunned to lower his voice properly, ask the question everyone else was avoiding. What if the humans had not brought a weapon to the war at all, but a solution they had been saving? That possibility lodged in Sen's thoughts and refused to leave. He gained provisional access to the restricted review circle not because he outranked its members, but because his office specialized in behavioral analysis under interspecies stress, and the chamber now contained stress in industrial volume. Inside the smaller command theater, the atmosphere was colder, tighter, stripped of ceremony. No public postures. No polished indignation. Here the coalition's most senior military minds studied raw battlefield shifts with the concentrated dread of people who knew exactly how impossible those shifts were. Humanity sent 3 officers in addition to Vance. None wore decorative rank emblems. None looked eager to impress anyone. The oldest of them, a dark-skinned woman with silver threaded through close-cropped hair, introduced herself only as Director Hale from Strategic Continuity. The title meant little to Sen and seemed to mean even less to the admirals until she began asking questions. Not about enemy strength. Not about frontline morale. Not even about casualties. She wanted decade-scale maintenance intervals for hostile relay architecture. She wanted recovery rates after logistical desynchronization. She wanted to know how quickly enemy command culture punished local initiative after timing failure. Every question cut away spectacle and went straight to systems behavior. Sen watched hardened commanders shift in their seats as the shape of human thinking came slowly into view. They were not asking how much damage had been done. They were asking how the enemy behaved when certainty failed. That, more than the reversed clocks, was the second real shock. For 11 years the coalition had fought the war as though the front line were the war. Defend the corridor. Reinforce the moon lattice. Delay the advance. Bleed them here so the next system has a chance. Every species had adapted to that logic because necessity leaves little room for philosophy. But Hale treated the front like an output rather than a cause. To her, the enemy's territorial advance was only the visible expression of something deeper: timing confidence, doctrinal rigidity, expectation of obedience, dependence on prediction. If those roots could be disturbed, the visible machinery might begin failing in ways raw firepower had never achieved. No one in the room liked hearing this, because everyone understood what it implied. The coalition had not merely been losing. It had been fighting inside a pattern the enemy preferred. The first intercepted confirmation arrived less than an hour later. Enemy command traffic, long considered one of the most disciplined communication structures in known space, had begun repeating priority authentication sequences across channels that should never have overlapped. Not a total breakdown. Something subtler and therefore more disturbing. Two sector commands issued the same course correction order to different fleets 17 minutes apart. A relay spine deep behind the active front stopped transmitting for 64 seconds, came back online, and resumed with timestamp drift that made half its message chain operationally suspect. A munitions convoy acknowledged instructions that no coalition analyst could trace to any originating source. The enemy, for the first time in recorded war, was not moving like a blade. It was moving like a hand that had suddenly remembered doubt. Sun looked across the command theater at Ambassador Vance. He expected vindication, perhaps even restrained triumph. Instead he saw something far more unsettling. Patience. Not the patience of waiting to be proven right, but the patience of someone watching a long-built mechanism begin to engage at exactly the speed intended. He understood then that the human vessel had not been sent to win a battle. It had been sent to make the enemy question whether its own war still obeyed the rules it trusted. That realization was still settling into him when a signal officer at the far tier went rigid over her console. Every conversation in the theater faltered as she pushed the intercept to the central display. A transmission had just entered hostile command architecture through one of the enemy's highest priority doctrinal channels. It carried valid structural formatting. It used a command register no Allied force had ever successfully replicated. And its origin point, buried beneath layers of routing distortion, matched the projected path of the lone human vessel. "Can you translate it?" someone asked. The officer swallowed once before answering. "It is in their war tongue," she said, "and it appears to be a message addressed directly to their central command." She hesitated, eyes still fixed on the unfolding decode. "Whoever sent it," she added quietly, understood exactly how to make sure it would be believed. The decode took 9 minutes, and in those 9 minutes the command theater became the most tightly wound space Vale had ever inhabited. No one moved more than necessary. No one raised a voice. Even the species who breathed audibly under stress seemed to learn silence by instinct, as if sound itself might disturb whatever impossible thing was now crawling through enemy command channels under a human signature. The intercept team worked beneath the hard blue light of their consoles, building the translation layer fragment by fragment while the hostile front continued to behave in ways no coalition doctrine had language for. A reserve column on the western collapse line halted, advanced, halted again, then split into 3 vectors too far apart for mutual support. 2 defense suppression barges fired on empty coordinates that had held Allied ships the day before, as though they were destroying ghosts generated by their own outdated timing models. Deep in the rear lattice, repair docks began refusing incoming hull trains that should have had full priority clearance, forcing damaged vessels into holding patterns that were already creating dangerous congestion. The enemy was not panicking. That would have been easier to understand. It was doing something much worse. It was trying, with perfect discipline, to obey a version of reality that no longer existed. When the translation finally stabilized, the room seemed to contract around the central display. Enemy's highest priority doctrinal channels. It carried valid structural formatting. It used a command register no Allied force had ever successfully replicated. And its origin point, buried beneath layers of routing distortion, matched the projected path of the lone human vessel. "Can you translate it?" someone asked. The officer swallowed once before answering. "It is in their war tongue," she said, "and it appears to be a message addressed directly to their central command." She hesitated, eyes still fixed on the unfolding decode. "Whoever sent it," she added quietly, understood exactly how to make sure it would be believed. The decode took 9 minutes, and in those 9 minutes the command theater became the most tightly wound space Vale had ever inhabited. No one moved more than necessary. No one raised a voice. Even the species who breathed audibly under stress seemed to learn silence by instinct, as if sound itself might disturb whatever impossible thing was now crawling through enemy command channels under a human signature. The intercept team worked beneath the hard blue light of their consoles, building the translation layer fragment by fragment while the hostile front continued to behave in ways no coalition doctrine had language for. A reserve column on the western collapse line halted, advanced, halted again, then split into 3 vectors too far apart for mutual support. 2 defense suppression barges fired on empty coordinates that had held Allied ships the day before, as though they were destroying ghosts generated by their own outdated timing models. Deep in the rear lattice, repair docks began refusing incoming hull trains that should have had full priority clearance, forcing damaged vessels into holding patterns that were already creating dangerous congestion. The enemy was not panicking. That would have been easier to understand. It was doing something much worse. It was trying, with perfect discipline, to obey a version of reality that no longer existed. When the translation finally stabilized, the room seemed to contract around the central display. The message was not a threat. It was not propaganda, nor mockery, nor a demand for surrender. It was an audit. In the enemy's own strategic register, with formatting so precise it passed through 3 command gates before being flagged for anomaly review, the human vessel had transmitted a correction sheet. It identified 6 logistical discrepancies inside the hostile war machine, named 3 timing failures in relay coordination, noted 2 false assumptions currently governing forward advance behavior, and concluded with a sentence so cold in its confidence that Sin felt the hair rise along his arms before the translation even finished rendering. "You are not being attacked at your perimeter. You are being informed that your perimeter is no longer where you believe it is." No one spoke after that. Then Director Hale, who had watched the translation with the same measured focus she had brought to everything else, asked the intercept officer to display the enemy response traffic rather than the message itself. That request, more than the message, revealed what humanity had truly done. Across multiple hostile sectors, command verification chains were multiplying at extraordinary speed. Authentication requests were being resent through alternate hierarchies. Timing authorities were cross-checking route permissions already in execution. Fleet groups were querying not the coalition, but each other. It was the pattern of a system checking its own pulse and finding extra beats. The human vessel had not merely entered hostile space. It had introduced doubt into a military organism whose power depended on never doubting itself. The revelation spread through the theater in layers. First shock, then comprehension, then something like a wrapped-in professional fear. For 11 years the coalition had measured the enemy in terms of tonnage, range, attrition tolerance, and strategic appetite. Humanity had apparently measured something else entirely. Trust latency, procedural rigidity, recovery behavior after synchronization loss, the shape of command confidence under stress. They had not built one ship to overpower an empire. They had built one ship to force that empire to look inward at the exact moment it most needed to keep looking ahead. The next reports made the doctrine uglier, smarter, and far more effective than anyone had guessed. The lone vessel, still unseen by coalition sensors and now only inferable through hostile reaction, had begun creating contradictions rather than destruction. Cargo manifests were reaching destination spines before the cargo itself. Local route priorities were being updated with authentic signatures but strategically impossible sequencing. Defensive subfleets were receiving verified warnings about strikes that would never occur, causing them to reassign screening patterns and leave genuine transfer corridors underprotected 2 hours later. No proof of infiltration appeared anywhere. No obvious sabotage. No shattered fleets drifting in fire. Instead, the enemy's vast war body was experiencing a rising number of internally credible impossibilities. That was the twist Sen had not been prepared for. Humanity had not sent a hidden superweapon into the dark. It had sent a machine for making certainty bleed. The emotional effect inside the command theater was immediate and deeply uncomfortable because it touched everyone present in a place more intimate than strategy. Every military culture built itself around some vision of order. Some trusted hierarchy, some discipline, some ritualized initiative, some redundancy. What the humans had found and weaponized was the universal fragility beneath them all. The moment when a command system can no longer tell whether its own instructions still describe the world outside. Once that fracture begins, every act of correction widens it. Check more trustless. Verify again, move slower. Reconfirm, reassign, hesitate. A machine built for relentless advance does not have to be destroyed if it can be taught to doubt the timing of its own limbs. Admiral Sarrett was the first coalition commander to say the obvious aloud. "This is not a strike operation," she said, staring at the widening web of hostile verification loops. "It is a doctrine." Director Hale nodded once. "Yes. How long have you had it?" Hale did not answer immediately, which meant the answer mattered. "Long enough," she said, "to know it should never be used early." The sentence dropped into the room like a sealed object too dangerous to open. Sen saw, almost physically, the implications spreading outward through the minds around him. Humanity had not invented this in desperation over the last month, nor improvised it in response to coalition collapse. This had been built, tested, refined, and withheld. Not because humans were indifferent to suffering, but because they had judged the timing of revelation as part of the weapon itself. Used too early and perhaps the enemy would have adapted. Used too often, and perhaps the galaxy would learn the wrong lesson about what humans were willing to do. Used now, when extinction had forced every other strategy to exhaustion, it arrived not as a boast but as an answer. Before anyone could press further, the front changed again. A full hostile spear array on the southern fracture line ceased advance formation and entered radial hold. That alone would have been historic. Then 3 rear echelon traffic arteries feeding that line went dark in sequence, not destroyed, simply absent from the hostile timing picture long enough to force doctrinal caution. The spear array's commanders responded exactly as humanity must have predicted. They did not charge blindly. They did not collapse. They widened defensive spacing, reduced thrust on the entire line, and requested high-order confirmation before resuming. On another day, against another enemy, such caution would have looked disciplined. In this moment it looked like fear taught by mathematics. The coalition should have felt hope then. Instead the room filled with a more volatile mixture, vindication, envy, disbelief, and the first dangerous taste of revenge. If the hostile front could hesitate, some argued, then now was the moment to hit it. Launch everything. Break the paused sectors before they restabilized. Seize back the moons, corridors, and fuel arches lost over the last 3 campaigns. The calls came quickly, emotionally, and with understandable force from commanders who had been retreating for most of their adult lives. Sen felt the pull of that logic himself. The maps were finally moving differently. How could they not strike? And yet the humans did not move. Vance stood at the edge of the command tier with her hands behind her back while the arguments surged around her. Hale watched the tactical display as if listening for a deeper rhythm beneath the room's impatience. Then she asked for 3 overlays: hostile internal reroute velocity, command authentication density, and civilian evacuation probability inside 12 occupied systems nearest the rear purge anchors. Sen did not understand the connection until the display combined them. Then his stomach turned. The enemy was beginning to contract inward, not only militarily but administratively. Route closures. Internal command isolation. Population registry locks. Resource seizure authorities. The kind of moves large powers made when they feared not battlefield loss, but narrative loss, when they prepared to preserve obedience through terror if coherence could not be preserved through confidence. Humanity's doctrine was working, but its very success was driving the hostile empire toward a more dangerous state. A system built on certainty, once stripped of certainty, does not become gentle. It becomes willing to burn whatever it can no longer fully control. Hale read the same conclusion a heartbeat before anyone else voiced it. They are preparing a purge architecture, she said. The room froze again, this time from a different kind of horror. Not against coalition worlds directly. Against their own occupied sectors. Against their own logistics chains. Against any node that might become a liability if the war's internal logic cracked too far. Better to cauterize than to lose cleanly. Better to turn the whole theater into obedient ash than let uncertainty spread upward into the Imperial center. A younger coalition commander whispered, almost to himself, "Can they do that?" Sarah answered without looking away from the display. "Any empire can." That changed everything. The humans had not built a perfect victory engine. They had built a precision tool for breaking inevitability, and like all true tools it came with a window. If the doctrine worked fast enough, the enemy might choose negotiated survival over structural humiliation. If it worked too slowly, or if the coalition lunged for blood at the wrong moment, the hostile state might resolve its confusion through atrocity vast enough to poison any victory that followed. Humanity had not merely opened a weakness. It had opened a race. The command theater, already tense, tightened into something almost unbearable. Hold and risk giving the enemy time to consolidate its inner terror. Attack and risk proving to that terror that total purge was justified. Wait for the humans and trust a civilization that still refused full disclosure. Every option now carried moral ruin in one hand and strategic ruin in the other. Then the final revelation arrived, and it reframed even that nightmare. A second hostile decode came through on a secured intercept line. Not from the enemy to the coalition, but from the enemy to itself, flagged as top-tier internal doctrinal review. The translation was partial, difficult, and riddled with damaged context, but one meaning emerged with brutal clarity. The hostile Central Command did not believe it was facing one ship. It believed it was facing permission. That was the word the translators settled on after arguing across 3 languages and 2 doctrinal archives. The humans had not convinced the enemy that they could destroy the war machine. They had convinced it that they could decide, selectively and at will, which parts of the war machine would continue functioning tomorrow. Convoys, relays, verification chains, route hierarchies, strategic timing. All of it no longer felt sovereign to the enemy. It felt conditional. The emotional force of that realization rolled through Sen with almost physical intensity. Power was terrifying enough when it promised annihilation. This was worse and greater at once. Humanity had demonstrated mastery without maximal violence. It had reached into the living clockwork of a conquering empire and made it understand that continuation itself was now being granted in measured portions. Not forever. Not unopposed. But long enough for the meaning to land. Across the front, hostile advance rates dropped by another 14%. 2 occupied systems entered emergency blackout. A command bastion 300 light-years behind the active line began broadcasting high-priority loyalty checks to its own sector fleets. The great machine was still enormous, still armed, still deadly beyond measure. But for the first time machine was still enormous, still armed, still deadly beyond measure. But for the first time it looked wounded in a place it did not know how to protect. And then, as if the universe had waited for the exact moment to make mercy impossible, the purge indicators on the 12 occupied systems shifted from preparation to readiness. Humanity had made the galaxy's conqueror hesitate. Now it had to stop it from becoming monstrous before hesitation turned into slaughter. Thought for a second. Phase 4, final climax, payoff and emotional impact. The room changed the instant the purge indicators turned live. Until that moment, the coalition's fear had still been divisible. There had been fear of the enemy, fear of the human unknown, fear of acting too slowly, fear of acting too soon. Distinct anxieties, each terrible enough to command a mind on its own. But when the occupied systems on the tactical wall lit with readiness sigils, civilian rel even years it no longer looked inevitable. Aegistry locks, transit interdictions, energy draw spikes from internal enforcement grids, all those separate fears fused into one unbearable fact. The enemy had been made uncertain, and uncertainty in a predatory empire had found the oldest refuge in history. If it could no longer trust its own future, it would make an example of the worlds trapped inside its present. Several commanders began speaking at once. Strike now. Punch through the stalled fronts. Force external pressure before the purge architecture could finish cycling. Others argued the reverse with equal urgency. A frontal move would validate the enemy's panic, confirm to its central command that disintegration had already begun, and trigger the very slaughter they were trying to prevent. For the first time since the emergency session began, the coalition was not divided by pride or suspicion. It was divided by desperation. Every officer in the chamber knew they were within reach of the first real turning point in 11 years, and every officer also knew one wrong decision could turn that turning point into a grave marker across 12 inhabited systems. Sin did not realize he was watching Ambassador Leora Vance until the room bent around her silence. She had not spoken through the worst of the argument. She had allowed the fear to crest, allowed exhausted admirals and furious ministers and grieving fleet liaisons to push themselves right up to the edge of reaction. Only then did she step toward the central display, not with dominance, but with the calm of someone about to touch a wounded machine in exactly the right place. When she asked for channel priority, the room yielded it almost involuntarily. "If you attack now," she said, "you will make their inner logic coherent again." No rhetoric, no dramatic emphasis. Just a statement so devastatingly clear that every voice cut out at once. Director Hale brought a hand across the tactical lattice, and new overlays unfolded over the 12 threatened worlds. Purge readiness windows. Command latency. Internal lock sequences. Reserve fleet positioning. Hostile doctrinal response curves. The image that emerged was ghastly in its elegance. The enemy was not yet committed to atrocity. It was poised before it, looking for a reason solid enough to override the fracture humanity had introduced. An external assault by the coalition would be exactly that reason. It would turn inner uncertainty into outer necessity. It would let the Empire explain its fear as temporary battlefield disruption rather than a deeper collapse of trust. It would make murder feel orderly again. "We cannot save those systems by attacking the front," Hale said. "We save them by proving that the front no longer determines the war." That sentence settled over the chamber like a law none of them had known existed. For years the coalition had dreamed of the same emotional resolution, the great counterstrike, the glorious reversal, the long-delayed moment when all the pain of retreat became forward motion. Humanity offered something harder and, somehow, grander. Not catharsis. Control. Not a scream of defiance into the dark, but the refusal to let the enemy choose the emotional shape of the ending. Sin felt the power of that difference in his bones. It was not merely that the humans were smarter. It was that they had enough strength to deny themselves the easy version of victory. Then the signal officer at Tier 4 stiffened and turned white. A transmission had appeared across a hostile executive command spine, narrowcast, high authority, severe in its formatting, and unmistakably linked to the same unseen human source that had already rewritten the war's emotional architecture. This time, however, the message was not buried inside hostile verification chains. It was placed where the enemy leadership could not avoid reading it. The coalition saw only fragments at first, translated in bursts while routing algorithms fought to keep pace. There was no boast in it. No insult. No demand for surrender. Humanity had sent the Empire a choice. The translation resolved line by line, and with each line Sin felt the chamber falling into deeper stillness. The human vessel identified the 12 occupied systems now under purge readiness and named the exact command nodes authorizing their lock sequences. It then demonstrated, in impossible detail, that the human asset already had selective reach over the architecture linking those nodes to their execution grids. Not total omnipotence. Not divine power. Something more believable and therefore more frightening. Measured, technical, undeniable superiority over the very systems the Empire had trusted to make internal violence clean. The final portion of the transmission arrived with brutal simplicity. "Continue this war, and we will decide for you what remains connected. Withdraw, and your command structure survives with dignity enough to negotiate." Choose quickly. We are already being more patient than your doctrine deserves. A long breath escaped someone behind Sin, and only then did he realize the room had gone several seconds without any sound at all. The humans had not threatened extermination. They had done something more devastating to a civilization built on certainty. They had defined proportional consequence. They had shown the Empire that escalation no longer belonged exclusively to the side that used terror best. More than that, they had done so while leaving the enemy a path to dignity. Not comfort, not triumph, but continuity. The offer was not kind. It was precise. It told the hostile state, in terms it could not mistake, that humanity was powerful enough to dismantle its war and disciplined enough not to dismantle its civilization if it chose correctly. No one in the chamber missed the deeper implication. If this was restraint, what would human ruthlessness look like? That question rippled outward and then buried itself beneath a more urgent one, because the tactical board had begun changing again. Purge indicators on the 12 occupied systems halted mid-cycle. They did not vanish. They froze. Across 3 rear command bastions, reserve fleets that had been aligning for punitive inward deployment shifted orientation and moved into static guard. Deep relay traffic surged to a level coalition analysts had never recorded before. The Empire was not retreating yet. It was arguing with itself at the highest level it possessed. Sin could almost feel the strain of it through the display. Continue and risk a future no command model could predict. Or withdraw and live with the fact that some other civilization had reached into your perfectly ordered warren. Fed made it conditional. The waiting that followed lasted only 43 minutes by clock, but it stretched across the chamber like an era. No one asked the humans for reassurance. None was offered. Vance stood with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the hostile internal traffic with the composed intensity of someone who had long ago accepted that the most important moments in history often look, from the outside, like stillness plus terrible mathematics. Hale exchanged occasional low remarks with her staff. The coalition commanders, so recently hungry to surge forward, remained fixed where they were, feeling perhaps for the first time what it meant to be held back not by weakness but by the discipline of someone who could already see beyond the next emotional impulse. Then one of the red front lines went gray. Not bright coalition blue. Not liberated. Not conquered. Gray, the color assigned to operational withdrawal under unconfirmed intent. A heartbeat later, a second line did the same. And then, in a sequence so orderly it felt almost ceremonial, the massive hostile spear arrays along the southern fracture zone began to turn. No rout followed. No shattering. No panic thrust burn away from the front. The enemy remained what it had always been: controlled, dangerous, formal even in concession. It withdrew screening elements first, then strike wings, then the heavy logistics spine feeding the stalled assault corridor, each movement timed to preserve defensive dignity. Watching it, Sin understood something he would remember for the rest of his life. Humanity had not broken the Empire by humiliating it publicly. It had cornered it so completely, and so intelligently, that retreat became the only choice left consistent with self-respect. The effect on the chamber was not explosive. It was stranger and more powerful than celebration. Some officers cried without sound. Others sat down abruptly as if their legs had simply forgotten what history felt like when it stopped repeating itself. Admiral Sarrett, who had not smiled once in the 11 years Sin had known her by reputation, placed one hand flat against the command rail and stared at the reversing vectors with an expression too large to resolve into any single emotion. The coalition had spent more than a decade measuring survival in hours gained and worlds delayed. Now the tide itself was moving backward, not because the enemy had run out of ships, but because one human answer had reached deeper than ships. A secondary notification appeared over the rear sectors. Purge readiness across the 12 occupied systems. Suspended. Not ended. Not forgiven. Suspended. But alive, and in that moment alive was everything. The hostile diplomatic channel opened 14 minutes later. No triumph passed through the human delegation. No visible exhale, no shared grin, no softened posture from people whose impossible gamble had just shifted the balance of a civilization-wide war. That, more than anything, completed the revelation. They had expected this not because victory was certain, but because they had understood the enemy so completely that even its surrender path had been built into the plan. Humanity was not improvising brilliance in the moment. It was executing the final movement of an argument prepared long before the coalition had realized argument itself could be a weapon. The first diplomatic packet from the enemy was clipped, formal, almost austere in its refusal to name what had happened in emotional terms. It requested an immediate cessation framework, verification corridors, and non-expansion guarantees under reciprocal observation. Even now the Empire would not confess fear. It did not need to. The request existed. After 11 years of relentless advance, after uncounted worlds consumed in the confidence of inevitability, the Conqueror was now asking for structure, limitation, and time. The galaxy's unstoppable force had not been blasted apart. It had been made to negotiate with reality. In the hours that followed, while secure channels multiplied and the coalition began the careful, disbelieving labor of transforming a halted catastrophe into a stable ceasefire, Sin found himself looking not at the maps but at Ambassador Vance. She had moved to the rear gallery overlooking the command theater, where the light was softer and the hum of tactical machinery faded into a distant metallic weather. For several minutes he simply stood near enough to be noticed and far enough to be ignored, watching the board below as gray lines spread slowly across sectors that had been red for so long many officers had stopped imagining any other color. "You knew they would choose survival," he said at last. Vance did not look at him immediately. "I knew they would recognize it when they were finally shown the cost of refusing it." "That sounds like certainty." "No," she said. "It sounds like preparation." He turned that over in silence. Below them, command crews from 6 species were already recalculating relief corridors for worlds that, an hour earlier, they had believed might be burned. Before dawn. The emotional weight of it was almost impossible to hold in one mind. Relief, grief, vindication, rage for the years already lost, awe at the quiet scale of what humans had done. Sen had spent a career studying perception under pressure, and even he could not organize what he felt into anything neat. "What was the vessel?" he asked finally. "Really?" That made her glance toward him, and in her eyes he saw neither pride nor secrecy in the usual sense. He saw judgment, measured and calm. "It was enough," she said. Nothing in her tone invited a second question, yet the answer itself was so much larger than refusal that it opened a final horizon rather than closing one. "Enough. Not all we had. Not all we can do. Not the edge of our reach, only the edge required." Sin felt the scale of the unseen human depth behind that word more profoundly than he would have felt any number. He looked back down at the shifting maps and understood, with a slow and almost painful clarity, what the coalition had mistaken all along. It had seen humanity's patience and called it youth. It had seen humanity's courtesy and called it idealism. It had seen humanity's silence and called it uncertainty. In truth, the humans had been doing what they did best when faced with a danger they could not morally ignore. And could not strategically afford to mishandle. They had been waiting until one precise act of force could save more than endless acts of fury ever would. Below them, across 100 tactical displays, the war continued to become something else. Withdrawal lanes replaced assault vectors. Relief estimates replaced casualty projections. For the first time in 11 years, the future on the command wall did not look like managed extinction wearing procedural language. It looked unfinished. And that, Sin realized, was humanity's greatest gift and most terrifying proof of power. Not that they had ended the war in a blaze of glorious destruction. That they had reached into inevitability itself, stopped it with one measured hand, and left the galaxy alive enough to decide what came next.